The man leaned toward the courtroom microphone, smiled as if he had already won, and said something that made the entire room go still. "Judge, you're remembering it wrong." For a moment, nobody moved. The plaintiff's fingers tightened around the edge of an old brown folder. The bailiff glanced toward the bench. Even the man's own attorney lowered his eyes. But Judge Judy did not react the way he expected. She simply looked at him. Then she looked down at the file in front of her. And somewhere inside that file was a witness the defendant had personally insisted would prove his innocence. He had no idea that the same witness was about to destroy his entire story. This was not going to be a normal argument over money. It was going to become a lesson in what happens when someone becomes so confident in a lie that they start believing they can rewrite what everyone else remembers. Before this story goes any deeper, make sure you are subscribed for more unforgettable courtroom stories. And comment below where you're watching from, because this case was about to turn in a way nobody in that courtroom expected. The man standing before Judge Judy was Daniel Mercer, a 46-year-old property manager who had spent years building a reputation for being calm, professional, and impossible to rattle. That reputation was exactly what he brought into the courtroom. He wore a charcoal suit, a spotless white shirt, and the relaxed expression of someone who believed the facts were already on his side. Across from him sat Emily Parker. She was 58, a community college administrator, and the owner of a small rental property she had inherited from her mother. Emily had not come to court looking for revenge. She had come because she claimed Daniel had taken control of her property during a 6-month management agreement, collected payments from tenants, and then refused to account for more than $11,000. Daniel said the accusation was absurd. According to him, Emily had simply misunderstood the agreement. Then, when Judge Judy began asking questions, he went one step further. He claimed Emily was confused. He said she had mixed up dates. He suggested grief over her mother's death had affected her memory. And then he made the mistake that changed everything. He told the judge that Emily was remembering events that had never happened. The accusation landed harder than the original dispute. Emily lowered her eyes, not because she believed him, because there was something painful about hearing a person confidently describe your own memories as fiction. The narrator could see what the courtroom could not yet fully understand. This case was never really about $11,000. The money was only the surface. Underneath it was a question Emily had been carrying for months. How much can someone take from you before they start telling you that you never owned it in the first place? Judge Judy noticed the way Emily held that brown folder against her lap. It was worn at the corners. The clasp was slightly bent. Several pages inside had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper had softened. There was no expensive attorney beside Emily, no polished legal team, just a folder, a notebook, and a woman who had clearly spent nights organizing every piece of evidence she could find. Daniel saw the folder too. He smiled. That smile mattered. Experienced judges know that confidence is not evidence. And Daniel was about to demonstrate exactly why. Judge Judy asked him to explain the management agreement. Daniel spoke quickly. He described the arrangement as simple. Emily had given him authority to collect rent, communicate with tenants, and handle ordinary property expenses. Then he claimed Emily had misunderstood what he was allowed to deduct. Judge Judy asked whether he had records. Yes, Daniel answered immediately. She asked whether the records supported his explanation. Absolutely. Again, immediate. No hesitation. No uncertainty. He looked toward Emily as though daring her to challenge him. But Judge Judy was not looking at Emily anymore. She was watching Daniel. His posture was relaxed. His hands were still. His answers were polished, almost too polished. Because every time the judge asked about a specific date, Daniel became less specific. When she asked about a particular payment, he gave a general explanation. When she asked for a receipt, he referred to the accounting. When she asked who had authorized a particular repair, he said Emily had. And when Judge Judy asked how he knew, Daniel gave the answer that would eventually come back to haunt him. She told me herself. Judge Judy paused. Who heard her say that? Daniel glanced toward his attorney, then toward the gallery, then back at the judge. No one needed to hear it. I was there. The courtroom went quiet. Judge Judy leaned back slightly. She had heard that kind of answer before. It was designed to sound reasonable because it placed the entire burden on memory. If Daniel was right, Emily had no way to prove otherwise. If Daniel was lying, he had built his defense around the assumption that nobody could contradict him. And then Judge Judy asked about the witness. Daniel had mentioned the witness himself earlier in the hearing. His name was Thomas Reed. Thomas had worked at the property for nearly 3 years as a maintenance supervisor. Daniel described him as a longtime professional contact who had witnessed several conversations between Daniel and Emily. Most importantly, Daniel said Thomas could confirm that Emily had approved the disputed deductions. Daniel actually appeared relieved when the judge brought his name up. That was the moment he believed the case was finished. He'll tell you exactly what happened, Daniel said. Judge Judy looked down at her notes. Then she looked back at him. Are you certain? Daniel smiled. Yes, that single word hung in the courtroom. Because Judge Judy already knew something Daniel didn't. Thomas Reed had been listed as a witness. And the statement attached to his testimony did not say what Daniel thought it said. The courtroom had not heard Thomas yet. Emily had not spoken about him, and Daniel still believed his own witness was going to rescue him, but there was one detail in Thomas's statement that Judge Judy had underlined before the hearing ever began. A date. A date Daniel had confidently sworn he was never at the property, and that date was about to turn his entire story upside down. Judge Judy closed the folder. She did not reveal the statement, not yet. She simply looked at Daniel and told him that she wanted to hear from Thomas Reed. For the first time that morning, Daniel's smile disappeared. The man who had spent nearly an hour explaining why everyone else remembered things incorrectly suddenly had nothing to say, because the person he had chosen to prove his story was about to walk into the courtroom. And he had no idea what that witness was carrying with him. The courtroom doors opened, and Thomas Reed stepped inside. Daniel Mercer watched him walk toward the witness stand with the same confidence he had carried all morning. But Emily Parker noticed something different. Thomas did not look at Daniel, not once. He took his seat, adjusted the papers in front of him, and kept his eyes fixed on Judge Judy. That small detail mattered. People often imagine that fear looks like shaking hands or a trembling voice. Sometimes it does. But real fear can also look perfectly still. Judge Judy studied Thomas for several seconds before asking him to explain his relationship with Daniel. Thomas had worked maintenance at the rental property for years. He knew the tenants. He knew the building. He knew when repairs were needed and when payments were collected. More importantly, he had been present during several conversations between Daniel and Emily. That was exactly why Daniel had wanted him there. On paper, Thomas looked like the perfect defense witness. He was older, experienced, and had no obvious reason to take Emily's side. Daniel had counted on that. But there was something Daniel had misunderstood. Thomas had not come to court to take anyone's side. He had come to tell the truth. Judge Judy asked Thomas about the disputed management agreement. Thomas explained that Emily had hired Daniel because she trusted him to manage the property while she dealt with her mother's estate. That sentence changed the emotional shape of the case. Emily had not simply handed a stranger control of a building. She had trusted someone while her life was already falling apart. Her mother had died several months earlier, leaving Emily with paperwork, family responsibilities, and a property she had never expected to manage alone. Daniel had presented himself as the person who could make everything easier. At first he did. He answered tenant calls. He arranged repairs. He collected rent. He told Emily she would not have to worry about the day-to-day problems. For someone grieving, that kind of help could feel like a lifeline. And that was where the deeper story began. The visible dispute was about accounting, but the emotional core was trust. Emily had not only lost money, she believed someone had taken advantage of the fact that she was overwhelmed. Judge Judy asked Thomas whether Emily had ever authorized Daniel to deduct certain expenses from the property account. Thomas answered carefully, "Not the way he says she did." Daniel shifted in his chair. It was the first visible crack in his confidence. Judge Judy asked Thomas to explain. Thomas said there had been a conversation about ordinary maintenance expenses, but Emily had specifically asked for receipts before any large deductions were made. Daniel had claimed the opposite. He had told the court Emily gave him broad permission to handle the expenses however he believed necessary. Thomas's testimony challenged that claim, but it was still only one person's memory. Judge Judy knew that, so she did not rush. She asked Thomas about the date Daniel had mentioned earlier, the date that Daniel claimed he had never visited the property with Emily. Thomas looked toward the judge, then he answered, "Yes, he was there." Daniel immediately shook his head. "No, that's not right." Judge Judy turned toward him. "Mr. Mercer, you'll have your turn." Daniel leaned back. But the damage was already beginning. The narrator could see the pattern forming. Daniel had spent the morning telling the courtroom that Emily was confused about dates. Now his own witness was giving a precise date that contradicted him. One contradiction can be explained, two can be dismissed. But when contradictions begin appearing in the exact places where someone has been most confident, they become something else. They become a pattern. Judge Judy asked Thomas what happened that day. Thomas said Daniel arrived at the property carrying a stack of documents. Emily was there too. The two of them had argued about the missing accounting records. Daniel had insisted everything was already documented. Emily had asked him to show her the receipts. According to Thomas, Daniel became irritated. He told Emily that if she did not trust him, she could find someone else to manage the property. Emily had apparently gone silent. Thomas remembered that moment clearly. She had looked down at the floor, then picked up the brown folder she had brought to court, the same folder now sitting beside her. The symbolic connection was impossible to miss. That folder was not just filled with paperwork, it represented months of trying to reconstruct what had happened. Receipts, bank statements, Amos handwritten notes, copies of messages. Every small piece of information Emily could save. Daniel had called it unnecessary paperwork. Judge Judy called it preparation. Then she asked Thomas one question. Did Miss Parker ever tell Mr. Mercer he could keep the disputed money? Thomas answered immediately. No. Daniel's attorney leaned toward his client. Daniel whispered something. Judge Judy noticed. She waited. Then she asked Thomas about another conversation. This one was more important. Thomas explained that a few weeks after the disputed payment, Daniel had asked him to confirm something in writing. He wanted Thomas to sign a statement saying Emily had approved the deductions. Thomas refused. Daniel had become angry. He told Thomas that everyone would be better off if they simply remembered the situation the same way. That sentence made Judge Judy look up. The courtroom seemed to shrink, because now the case was no longer just about whether Daniel had misunderstood Emily. It was about whether Daniel had been trying to manufacture a version of events that other people would repeat. Judge Judy asked Thomas if he still had the message Daniel sent him afterward. Thomas nodded. Yes. Daniel's face changed. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. The judge asked whether the message was available. Thomas reached into a folder. Daniel stared at it. And suddenly, the same man who had spent the morning telling everyone else they had remembered things incorrectly seemed to realize something terrifying. His own words might remember everything for him. Judge Judy held out her hand. Thomas placed the printed message in front of her. She read it silently. Then she looked at Daniel. She did not accuse him. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked, Mr. Mercer, Would you like to explain why your witness has a message from you asking him to change his memory? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The courtroom went completely silent. Because Judge Judy had not yet shown the message to anyone, she was giving him one final opportunity to tell the truth. And whatever he said next would determine whether this was merely a disputed property account or something much deeper. Daniel Mercer stared at the message in Judge Judy's hand. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he smiled again. It was a smaller smile this time. Careful, measured. The kind of smile people use when they realize the room has stopped believing them, but they are still trying to convince themselves they are in control. Your Honor, Daniel finally said, that message is being taken completely out of context. Judge Judy did not look impressed. Thomas Reed remained perfectly still. Emily Parker looked down at the brown folder in front of her. The narrator could almost feel the shift. Daniel had entered the courtroom believing the case was about whether Emily could prove her accusation. Now he was being forced to explain why his own witness had evidence contradicting him, and that difference was enormous. Daniel was no longer building a defense. He was trying to repair one. Judge Judy asked him what the message meant. Daniel said Thomas had misunderstood what he was asking. He claimed he had only wanted Thomas to clarify a conversation because Emily had been confusing several dates. Again, the blame moved toward Emily. That was Daniel's strategy. Whenever a fact threatened him, he redirected attention toward the person making the accusation. But Judge Judy had already seen the pattern. She asked him whether the message specifically asked Thomas to change anything he had written down. Daniel hesitated. No. Judge Judy looked toward Thomas. Thomas quietly said, "It did." Daniel immediately interrupted. "That's not what I meant." Judge Judy raised one hand. The interruption stopped. She looked back at Daniel. "You said you wanted the court to hear from Mr. Reed because he remembered everything clearly." Daniel nodded. "He does." "Then why?" Judge Judy asked. "Does his memory suddenly become unreliable when it disagrees with yours?" Silence. That was the question Daniel had been trying to avoid. The courtroom did not need a dramatic outburst. The contradiction was enough. Daniel shifted in his chair. His attorney leaned closer and whispered something to him. Daniel nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the judge. He was beginning to understand that the courtroom was no longer moving according to his script. Judge Judy asked Thomas to describe the property account. Thomas explained that Daniel had control over the account used for maintenance and rental expenses. He also explained something Daniel had not mentioned. Several payments had been made directly to Daniel. Not to contractors, not to suppliers. To Daniel, Daniel immediately objected. He claimed those payments were legitimate management fees. Judge Judy asked where that authorization appeared in the agreement. Daniel pointed to a section. The judge read it. Then she read it again. The language did not say what Daniel claimed. It permitted a fixed management fee. It did not authorize the additional deductions Daniel had taken. Emily had been telling the truth about one thing all along. She had asked for an accounting. Daniel had simply never provided one. The narrator could see why this case had become more psychological than financial. A person can argue about a number, but when someone repeatedly tells another person that they are confused, forgetful, emotional, or imagining things, the goal can become much larger than winning an argument. It can become control. Daniel had tried to make Emily doubt her own memory. He had told her that she misunderstood the agreement. He had told her that she forgot conversations. He had told her that she was mixing up dates. And now his own witness was standing in court saying those dates were accurate. That was the moment Judge Judy seemed to understand what had really happened. She asked Daniel whether he had ever told Emily that she was making things up. Daniel looked toward his attorney. The attorney said nothing. Daniel finally answered, "I may have said something like that." Emily's expression changed, not dramatically. She simply closed her eyes for a moment. The narrator could explain what that moment meant. Sometimes the deepest wound in a courtroom is not the amount of money. It is hearing the sentence you remember being told repeated in public, and finally having someone else confirm that you were not imagining it. Judge Judy turned toward Emily. She did not ask her to explain herself. She did not need to. Thomas had already begun doing that for her. Then Judge Judy returned to Daniel. Mr. Mercer, you said earlier that Miss Parker never asked you for receipts. Daniel nodded. She did not. Judge Judy looked at the file. She says she did. She's mistaken. Thomas spoke quietly. She asked him in front of me. Daniel turned sharply toward Thomas. You weren't part of that conversation. Thomas looked directly at him. I was standing 6 feet away. The courtroom froze. That answer was simple. No drama, no performance, just a fact. And Daniel's reaction told Judge Judy even more. His shoulders tightened, his jaw clenched, his eyes moved toward the door before returning to the bench. The confidence was leaving him. But Judge Judy was not finished. She asked Thomas one final question about the day Daniel had supposedly never visited the property. Thomas said he remembered because Daniel had arrived carrying a blue envelope. Daniel's face changed. It was tiny, almost invisible. But Judge Judy caught it. Emily did too. That envelope had never been mentioned in the complaint. It had never been mentioned in Daniel's testimony. But Emily knew exactly what Thomas was talking about. She reached into the brown folder and pulled out a photograph of the blue envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. The date was visible in the corner, the same date Daniel had denied being there. The courtroom suddenly had something more powerful than memory. It had a timestamp. Daniel stared at the photograph, then he looked at Thomas. For the first time all morning, he did not look angry. He looked afraid. Judge Judy slowly placed the photograph beside the message. One piece of evidence created doubt. The second created tension. Now the third was changing the entire case, but Judge Judy had one more piece of evidence. And unlike the photograph, this one could not be explained away as a misunderstanding. She reached for the sealed envelope sitting beneath the rest of the documents. Daniel saw it. His attorney saw it. Thomas saw it. Emily did not. Judge Judy looked at Daniel and said only one sentence. Before this court hears what is inside, Mr. Mercer has one last opportunity to explain why it exists. Daniel swallowed. Because whatever was inside that envelope had apparently been important enough for Judge Judy to keep it sealed until this exact moment. And Daniel suddenly realized the most dangerous witness in the courtroom was not Thomas. It was the evidence itself. Daniel Mercer stared at the sealed envelope. For the first time that morning, he looked like a man who wanted the courtroom to stop asking questions. Judge Judy did not open it, not yet. She let the silence stretch. That silence was doing something Daniel's explanations never could. It was forcing him to sit with the possibility that the story he had carefully constructed was about to collapse under its own weight. Mr. Mercer, Judge Judy said, you told this court that you were never at the property on that date. Yes, you told this court that Miss Parker never asked you for receipts. Yes. You told this court that Mr. Reed would confirm your version. Yes. She glanced at Thomas. He has not. Daniel shifted. He's mistaken. Judge Judy looked back at him. Then why is your witness contradicting you on every important point? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came. The courtroom remained silent. Then he tried again. Because he's angry with me. Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. Why? Daniel hesitated. Thomas answered before he could. Because I refused to sign the statement. Daniel turned toward him. What statement? Thomas looked at the judge. The one he wanted me to sign. The lawyer beside Daniel suddenly sat upright. That was the moment the room changed. Judge Judy asked Thomas to explain exactly what he meant. Thomas said Daniel had brought him a typed statement after the disputed accounting began. The statement claimed Emily had approved every disputed deduction. Thomas had read it. Then he refused to sign. Daniel had told him that signing would simply clear up the misunderstanding. Thomas said he told Daniel he would not sign something he knew was untrue. Daniel's response had been simple. He said, "I would regret making things difficult." Emily looked up. Judge Judy's expression hardened, not with anger. With recognition, the threat was not the loudest part. The manipulation was, Daniel had apparently understood that if he could convince enough people that Emily was confused, then her version of events would become easier to dismiss. But Thomas had refused to participate. Judge Judy finally reached for the sealed envelope. Daniel's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we object to." Judge Judy looked up. The attorney stopped. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single printed document. Then another. Then a small flash drive. Daniel stared at the items. His face went pale. Judge Judy picked up the first document. It was a copy of the statement Daniel had asked Thomas to sign. The second document was a handwritten note from Thomas explaining why he had refused, and the flash drive contained something even more important, a recording. Daniel's attorney asked whether the recording had been properly authenticated. Judge Judy calmly explained that the court would address admissibility before relying on it. Then she looked at Thomas. "Is this your recording?" Thomas nodded. "Yes. Did you make it during the conversation with Mr. Mercer?" "Yes." "Does it accurately reflect what was said?" "Yes." Daniel suddenly leaned forward. "That recording doesn't prove anything." Judge Judy looked at him. "You haven't heard it yet." He stopped. That was the mistake. He had just argued against evidence he had not heard. And Judge Judy noticed. The recording began. The courtroom heard Daniel's voice. He was calm, friendly, almost casual. He spoke to Thomas about the statement. He explained that Emily was emotional, that she was confused, that she had been under pressure, that it would be better for everyone if Thomas simply confirmed what Daniel had already written. Then came the sentence that destroyed his entire strategy. Daniel's recorded voice said that once Thomas signed the statement, Emily would start doubting her own timeline. The courtroom went silent. Emily closed her eyes. Thomas lowered his head. Daniel stopped moving. Judge Judy paused the recording. She did not need to play anything else yet. The phrase had revealed the intention behind everything. This was not simply a disagreement over memory. Daniel had understood that Emily's uncertainty could be used against her. He had tried to turn her grief into a weakness. He had tried to make her question her own recollection. And he had assumed nobody would catch him. Judge Judy looked at Daniel. "You called her confused." Daniel said nothing. "You called her mistaken." Nothing. "You told this court she was remembering events that never happened." Daniel stared at the table. "And now this recording suggests you were deliberately trying to influence another witness so that her timeline would appear unreliable." Daniel's attorney tried to intervene, but Judge Judy was already looking at the evidence. She asked for the photograph, then the message, then the written statement. One after another, the pieces were placed together. The blue envelope, the date, the witness testimony, the message, the statement, the recording, the proof ladder was complete. The story Daniel had told the court was no longer standing. It had become a collection of contradictions. The narrator could almost hear the courtroom breathing again. This was the psychological turning point. Daniel had entered believing he could control the narrative by controlling people's confidence in their own memories. But the evidence had created a timeline stronger than anyone's recollection. And timelines do not get intimidated. Judge Judy turned toward Thomas. "Mr. Reed, did Mr. Mercer ever tell you that Miss Parker was lying?" Thomas nodded. "Yes. Did he ever ask you to help him prove that?" "Yes," Daniel finally spoke. "That is not what happened." Judge Judy looked directly at him, then explained the recording. Daniel froze. There it was, the question that required no complicated legal argument, no long explanation, no dramatic speech, just one simple demand. "Explain your own words." Daniel looked at his attorney. The attorney had no answer for him. Daniel looked at Thomas. Thomas did not look away. Then he looked at Emily. She was holding the brown folder against her chest. And finally, Daniel looked back at Judge Judy. His confidence was gone, but he still had one last card. He claimed the recording had been edited. That gave him a final opening. Judge Judy asked whether he had evidence proving that. Daniel said no. She asked whether he could identify any sentence in the recording that had been altered. He could not. Then Judge Judy asked for the original file. Thomas produced it. The timestamp matched. The recording was intact. Daniel's last defense disappeared. And now Judge Judy had something even more damaging than a contradiction. She had proof that the contradiction was intentional. She looked at the sealed envelope again, then toward Daniel. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "there is one thing this court has not addressed." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Judge Judy lifted a final page from the envelope. It contained the names of 3 other property owners, 3 people Daniel had previously managed, 3 names that had nothing to do with Emily's lawsuit. Daniel's attorney immediately stood. "Your Honor?" Judge Judy stopped him because the case had just become bigger than anyone expected. And the final page suggested Emily might not have been the first person Daniel tried to convince that their own memory was wrong. If you can already see where this is going, comment justice below, because the next piece of evidence was about to reveal why this case had never really been about one missing payment. Judge Judy placed the page on the bench. Then she read the first name aloud. Daniel's face changed again. And this time, even his attorney looked frightened, because the name belonged to someone Daniel had never mentioned in court. Someone who had been waiting outside the courtroom. Someone who had apparently been watching everything. And someone Judge Judy was about to call forward. Judge Judy looked at the first name on the page. Margaret Collins. Daniel Mercer stopped breathing for a second. The reaction was immediate, not confusion. Recognition. Judge Judy noticed it. So did Thomas. So did Emily. The courtroom had just crossed a line Daniel had spent the entire hearing trying to prevent. This was no longer simply a dispute between one property owner and one manager. The page contained 3 former clients, and beside each name was a date, an amount, and a short handwritten note. Judge Judy asked the bailiff to bring Margaret Collins into the courtroom. A woman in her 60s slowly entered. She carried a small purse and a folder of her own. Daniel stared at her. Margaret looked at him once. Then she looked away. That told the story before she said a word. Judge Judy asked whether Margaret had previously hired Daniel to manage a property. Yes. She asked whether she had ever accused him of withholding money. Yes. Daniel immediately shook his head. That case was settled. Judge Judy looked at him. That's not what I asked. Daniel fell silent. Margaret explained that she had originally believed Daniel had simply made an accounting mistake. Then she noticed several deductions she could not explain. When she questioned him, he told her she was confused about the agreement, the same phrase, the same strategy, the same pattern. Judge Judy asked Margaret whether she had ever spoken to Thomas. No. That made the room even quieter. 2 people who had never discussed their experiences were describing remarkably similar behavior. Judge Judy turned to Daniel. He tried to explain that property management naturally involved disputes, that some clients were difficult, that misunderstandings happened. Judge Judy listened. Then she asked Margaret one question. Did Mr. Mercer ever ask you to stop looking at the original records and trust his summary instead? Margaret nodded. Yes. Daniel's attorney closed his eyes. The narrator could see the power reversal happening in real time. Daniel had spent the entire morning trying to make Emily look unreliable. Now another person was describing the exact same behavior without knowing what Emily had said. That mattered. A pattern does not prove every allegation by itself. But a pattern can explain why one contradiction suddenly deserves much closer attention. Judge Judy looked at the second name, Robert Hayes. Robert had owned a small duplex. He had also hired Daniel. And according to the notes, he had disputed a series of unexplained deductions. Robert entered the courtroom. He carried no dramatic evidence, no expensive lawyer. Just an old envelope containing copies of his original statements. He explained that Daniel had once told him the same thing. You're remembering it wrong. The sentence landed like a hammer. Emily looked toward Judge Judy. Thomas lowered his eyes. Daniel's face had become completely expressionless. Then came the third name, Linda Parker. She had no relation to Emily, despite sharing the same surname. She had hired Daniel 2 years earlier, and she had kept every email. Judge Judy asked Linda whether she had ever been told that she was confused when she questioned Daniel's accounting. Linda said yes. The courtroom went silent. 3 people, 3 separate properties, 3 separate disputes. And the same method. Daniel finally tried to defend himself. He said the witnesses were simply unhappy former clients. But Judge Judy did not need to argue with him. She had something better, the original emails, the dates, the accounting records, the messages. And Thomas's recording. One by one, the pieces connected. The narrator could explain why the evidence was so devastating. Daniel's defense depended on uncertainty. If Emily was confused, her memory could be questioned. If Thomas was angry, his testimony could be dismissed. If Margaret was dissatisfied, her complaint could be called a grudge. If Robert was mistaken, his records could be challenged. If Linda was emotional, her emails could be minimized. But together, the stories created something Daniel could not easily explain away. Consistency. Judge Judy returned to the original dispute. She asked Daniel whether the additional $11,000 had ever been properly accounted for. Daniel said he believed it had. She asked for the records. His attorney produced them. Judge Judy examined the pages. Then she compared them with Emily's bank records. The numbers did not match. The courtroom seemed to become smaller. Judge Judy pointed to one payment. Daniel had listed it as a contractor expense. Emily's records showed the money went directly into an account controlled by Daniel. Judge Judy pointed to another. The same thing, then another. Agan Daniel's attorney stopped taking notes. The evidence was now speaking for itself. The brown folder that Daniel had mocked earlier suddenly became the strongest object in the courtroom. Every receipt Emily had saved, every email she had printed, every date she had written down, every piece of paper she had kept because she was afraid someone would tell her she was imagining things. It had all become a timeline. And the timeline was telling a story Daniel could no longer control. Judge Judy looked at Emily. "Ems Parker, when did you first realize something was wrong?" Emily took a breath. She said it was not when she noticed the missing money. It was when Daniel started making her question her own memory. That answer changed the emotional weight of the case. She explained that after her mother died, she had already felt overwhelmed. She began second-guessing herself. She would check an email and wonder whether she had misunderstood it. She would find a receipt and wonder whether she had forgotten another conversation. Then she started keeping everything, not because she wanted to build a lawsuit, because she wanted to know whether she could trust herself. The courtroom went quiet. Judge Judy looked down at the brown folder. Then she looked at Daniel. "You didn't just dispute her records," she said. "You attacked her confidence in her own memory." Daniel shook his head. "That wasn't my intention." Judge Judy's response was calm. "Your intention is not the only thing this court can examine. Your actions matter." Daniel looked toward the floor. The arrogance was gone. The performance was gone. What remained was a man staring at evidence he had believed would never exist. Judge Judy then returned to the financial records. She calculated the documented amount. The disputed deductions were larger than Emily had originally claimed, and one final transfer appeared on the statement. It had been made after Emily demanded an accounting. Daniel had not mentioned it. His attorney had not mentioned it, and Daniel had signed the authorization himself. Judge Judy looked up. "Mr. Mercer, why did you tell this court you had never received this payment?" Daniel's lips parted. No answer. She asked again. Nothing. Thomas looked at Emily. Emily looked at the page. The room was silent. Then Daniel finally whispered that he had forgotten. Judge Judy did not blink. The same man who had spent hours insisting Emily's memory was unreliable had just used the exact defense he had attacked her for using: forgotten, confused, mistaken. The words had come full circle. Judge Judy placed the document on the bench. She looked at Daniel and said, "People who manipulate memories eventually become trapped by their own version of events." Daniel's eyes dropped. The proof was complete. The financial records established the money. The photograph established the date. Thomas's testimony established the conversation. The message established the pressure. The recording established intent. And the former clients established the pattern. But there was still one final question. What would Judge Judy do with all of it? The courtroom waited. Emily held her mother's old brown folder against her chest. Thomas sat quietly. Margaret, Robert, and Linda watched from the gallery. Daniel sat motionless beside his attorney. The man who had walked into court believing he could control the story had finally lost control of the one thing he depended on most. The narrative. Judge Judy closed the file. And everyone in that courtroom knew the verdict was coming. But before she delivered it, she had one final sentence to say to Daniel. And it was going to be the sentence he remembered long after the courtroom emptied. Judge Judy closed the file. For several seconds, she said nothing. Daniel Mercer sat completely still. The confidence that had carried him into the courtroom that morning was gone. His shoulders had dropped. His hands were folded tightly together. His attorney no longer whispered advice. Across the courtroom, Emily Parker held the old brown folder against her lap. The folder that had once represented doubt had become the record of the truth. Judge Judy looked at Daniel. "This court has heard your explanation." She glanced at the evidence. "It has also heard your witness." Thomas Reed remained silent. Judge Judy continued. "The photograph contradicts your timeline. The financial records contradict your accounting. Your messages contradict your testimony. And your own recording contradicts your explanation of why you contacted Mr. Reed." Daniel lowered his eyes. Then came the final question. "Mr. Mercer, is there anything in this file that you can truthfully dispute?" Daniel looked at the pages. He looked at his attorney, then at Emily. For once, he did not blame her. He did not blame Thomas. He did not blame confusion. He simply shook his head. "No, Your Honor." The courtroom went silent. It was the first completely honest answer Daniel had given all morning. Judge Judy nodded. The decision was immediate. The disputed funds were awarded back to Emily, along with the documented costs directly connected to Daniel's conduct. But the money was only part of the consequence because the evidence raised concerns far beyond one accounting disagreement. Judge Judy ordered that the relevant materials be preserved and referred for appropriate review regarding the financial records and witness-related conduct. The courtroom did not erupt. There was no dramatic cheering. Instead, something quieter happened. Emily exhaled. Her shoulders relaxed. She looked down at the brown folder one final time. The same folder she had carried into court because she was afraid that someone would tell her she had remembered everything incorrectly. Now she knew she had not. Thomas looked toward her and gave a small nod. Margaret, Robert, and Linda remained seated in the gallery. They had not come expecting to become part of the story, but their experiences had helped establish something important. Emily had not been imagining a pattern. She had been describing one. Judge Judy turned toward Daniel. Then she delivered the sentence that would become the defining moment of the case. Confidence can disguise a lie for a while, but evidence remembers every detail the liar hopes everyone forgets. 18 words, no shouting, no insult, just a sentence that landed harder because Daniel had spent the entire hearing proving it. He had believed confidence could replace evidence. He had believed repetition could turn a lie into memory. He had believed that if he made Emily doubt herself, everyone else would doubt her too. But the courtroom had shown the opposite. Evidence does not need confidence. It does not need a perfect voice. It does not need someone powerful standing behind it. It only needs to survive examination. Emily's victory was not really about the $11,000. When the hearing ended, she remained seated for a moment. She looked at Thomas, then at the judge. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not collapse. She simply nodded. The narrator could understand why. She was not crying because she had won money. She was crying because someone had finally confirmed what she had been afraid to believe about herself. Her memory was not broken. Her questions were not unreasonable. Her insistence on seeing the records had not made her difficult. She had been right to keep looking. The brown folder had become the symbol of that. Every receipt inside it represented one moment when Emily had refused to let someone else define reality for her. And that is why the case stayed with everyone who witnessed it. Not because Daniel was exposed. Not because the courtroom became dramatic, but because the case revealed something painfully human. When someone cannot defeat the facts, they may try to make you doubt yourself instead. They may call you confused. They may tell you that you misunderstood. They may insist you remembered incorrectly. And if they repeat it enough times, you may begin asking yourself the same question. What if I'm wrong? Emily had nearly reached that point. Then she started keeping records. Thomas refused to change his story. And the evidence did what evidence is supposed to do. It spoke when everyone else had finished arguing. Within 24 hours, the story of the unusual courtroom confrontation had begun circulating among people who knew the property dispute. Within 48 hours, the other former clients had been asked to preserve their records. And by 72 hours, Emily's small brown folder had become the image everyone associated with the case. Not the expensive suit Daniel wore. Not his confident smile, not his polished explanations, the folder, because that folder represented something much bigger than paperwork. It represented the moment an ordinary person decided that her own memory deserved to be checked, protected, and believed. And Daniel's own witness had helped prove it. Thomas never became a hero because he wanted attention. He simply refused to sign something he knew was false. That quiet decision changed everything. It is easy to imagine courage as something loud. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes courage is a maintenance worker sitting in a courtroom, looking at a powerful former employer and saying, "That's not what happened." Sometimes justice begins with one person refusing to participate in someone else's version of reality. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a manipulator can face is not an angry opponent. It is a witness who remembers. The courtroom eventually emptied. Emily gathered her papers. She carefully closed the brown folder. This time, she did not hold it like a shield. She carried it like proof that the truth had survived. Proof that her voice had mattered, proof that someone could try to rewrite the past, but could not erase what had been documented. And Daniel? He walked out without the confidence he had brought in. Because the man who had tried to convince everyone else that they were remembering things incorrectly had finally been forced to confront the one thing he could not gaslight: the evidence. That is the lesson hidden inside this fictional courtroom story. Truth does not always arrive with a dramatic confession. Sometimes it arrives as a photograph with a date, a message someone forgot to delete. A witness who refuses to change their story, a bank record, a recording, or an old brown folder carried into court by someone who simply refused to stop believing that the truth mattered. And when all those pieces finally meet, confidence stops being powerful, because the truth has something confidence never will: a record. If this story reminded you that accountability matters, subscribe for more courtroom stories where manipulation meets evidence. Like this video, share it with someone who believes truth should always have a chance to speak. And comment below. *. What would you have done if you were sitting in that courtroom?